They buried an empty coffin. Nobody in that churchyard knew it. Not the priest who read the service, not the mourners who tossed cold dirt onto polished mahogany, and certainly not the grief-stricken naval captain standing in the rain, watching the woman he loved disappear into the ground forever. 5 years later, that same man would walk into his own library, past midnight, and find her on her knees in front of his fireplace, alive, starving, and scrubbing his floors under a stranger's name. This is a story about a lie that lasted half a decade. And about what happens when the truth finally claws its way back to the surface. The Duke of Cutton had not slept properly in years. Sleep required a quiet mind, and his had not been quiet since November of 1821. That night, Alaric Weston was still only Captain Weston, a second son with a naval commission and very little money, sitting in a rented room above a tavern near the Cutton estate, staring at the ashes of a fire he hadn't bothered to feed. Parliament had kept him at Westminster until nearly midnight, arguing about grain prices while men slept in doorways 2 streets away. He was tired in the particular way that had nothing to do with hours awake and everything to do with hours endured. He shrugged off his coat, dropped it without ceremony onto the nearest chair, and walked toward his private library seeking the one thing that had never disappointed him, silence, and a decent bottle of scotch. He didn't get either. The smell hit him first. Lye soap, sharp and acidic, cutting straight through the familiar scent of leather and old paper. Someone was crouched by the hearth in the near dark, scrubbing at soot-blackened brick with the kind of grim, mechanical effort that belonged to someone who had done this exact motion 10,000 times before and expected to do it 10,000 more. "The fires can wait until morning," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. The woman flinched so hard her brush clattered against the stone. She folded in on herself instantly, shoulders up, chin down, the posture of someone who had learned, the hard way, that sudden movements from men in fine coats were rarely good news. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she murmured, not lifting her head. "Mrs. Higgins wants the hearth spotless before dawn. I was behind today." He didn't care about Mrs. Higgins. He barely registered the words. He wanted his drink and his solitude, and he told her, again, to go to bed. She rose too fast, clutching her rag like a shield, and tried to slip past him along the edge of the desk. That's when her foot caught the corner of the rug. It was nothing. A stumble. The kind of small, clumsy moment that happens to exhausted people a dozen times a day. But as she threw a hand out to steady herself, moonlight from the tall windows fell across her face for exactly 1 second. The glass slipped from his fingers. He didn't feel it shatter against the floor. He didn't feel the scotch soak into his boots. All he felt was the sudden, violent absence of air in his lungs. Gray eyes. The exact gray of a winter sea just before a storm breaks. A small scar through the left eyebrow that he remembered kissing once, years ago, after she'd fallen from a garden wall trying to avoid her father's guests. The face was thinner now, hollowed by hunger in a way that made his chest ache just looking at it. But it was her face. There was no mistaking it, not after all the nights he'd conjured it from memory and hated himself for how badly it hurt. Penelope. Her name came out of him like something torn loose. The maid, Jane, she stammered, Jane from the kitchens, took a step backward, eyes wide with panic. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gripped her chin before he could stop himself, forcing her face up into the light. "Look at me," he said. She kept her eyes shut. A single tear cut a track through the soot on her cheek. "Look at me." When she finally opened them, the servant's mask cracked apart completely, and underneath it was a woman he hadn't seen in 5 years, exhausted, guarded, but unmistakably, impossibly alive. "Hello, Alaric," she whispered. He stumbled back like her skin had burned him. In his mind he was suddenly standing in a churchyard again, rain running down the back of his naval coat, staring at a headstone with her name carved into it. He had paid for that stone himself. He had watched them lower the coffin. "You died," he said. It wasn't a question. "I saw the grave." "My father found something cheaper than a wedding," she said flatly. There was no music left in her voice. The voice he remembered had laughed easily and often. This one sounded like someone who had spent years learning to say almost nothing at all. He told you I choked to death on my own blood, didn't he? Wore black. Played the grieving father beautifully, I'd imagine. I almost did choke, she added, when he said nothing. Just not the way you were told. Piece by piece, standing amid broken crystal in his own library, Alaric learned the shape of the lie. Her father had owed a staggering debt to a man named Viscount Carlyle, a man with a reputation, in certain smoke-filled clubrooms, for cruelty dressed up as eccentricity. Carlyle hadn't wanted a willing bride. He'd wanted something he could own outright and never be questioned about. So a coffin went into the ground empty, a headstone went up over nothing, and Penelope Alden was loaded into a closed carriage and driven to Yorkshire as a dead woman. I stopped existing the moment that carriage left London, she told him. 3 years of that house taught me exactly how much a wife is worth when her husband decides she's disposable. She didn't elaborate on the details, she didn't have to. Alaric had seen the way she held her right shoulder, slightly wrong, like it had healed without ever being properly set. He'd seen the fading marks along her jaw that powder couldn't quite hide. Eventually, she ran. Waited until Carlyle drank himself unconscious, took what coins she could find in his coat, and rode the freezing London road on the roof of a mail coach because that was the only fare she could afford. In the city, a woman alone with no name, no family, and no references had exactly 2 options: she could be prey, or she could disappear. She chose to disappear into the one place nobody looks twice, the servants' hall of a great house, 70 staff deep, where a scullery maid is furniture, not a person. She had no idea, when she took the position 2 years earlier, that the house belonged to the family of the man she'd once promised to marry, or that fate would eventually make him its duke. I saw you in the courtyard once, she admitted, voice cracking for the first time. Months ago. I hid behind the laundry carts so you wouldn't see me like this. I wanted to stay dead in your memory. At least there, I was still someone you could love. That single sentence undid him more completely than anything else she'd said. He didn't see the soot anymore, or the coarse grey wool, or the raw, cracked hands. He knelt right there on the broken glass, a duke, on his knees, in front of a scullery maid, and took her battered hands in his like they were the most precious thing in the house. You are not ruined, he told her. You are not invisible. And you are never setting foot in that kitchen again. What followed wasn't gentle in the way fairy tales are gentle. It was practical, urgent, and a little bit ruthless, because Alaric understood, even in that first shocked hour, that saving her required more than sentiment. He kicked over her scrub bucket so there'd be no hearth left to finish, no excuse to keep kneeling in the ashes. He woke the household at 4 a.m, ordered a bath drawn in the guest suite reserved for visiting royalty, and told his butler, a man who had served the family for 40 years and did not so much as blink at the sight of the Duke gripping a soot-covered maid by the wrist, to bring food, and to ask no questions. Penelope stood in that opulent room afterward, dripping filthy water onto a priceless carpet, apologizing for the mess she was making. Alaric told her he'd burn the house down before he let her apologize for existing in it. She locked herself in the washroom alone. Standing in front of the fogged mirror, she finally let herself look, really look, at what 3 years of marriage and 2 years of hiding had done to her body. The ribs. The old bruises. The crooked collarbone that had healed wrong because she'd never dared call for a doctor. She scrubbed until her skin turned pink and raw, trying to wash away not the dirt, but the years. When she came out wrapped in a robe far too large for her, there was food waiting, and old instincts don't disappear just because danger does. Halfway through the meal, without quite deciding to, she slipped half a piece of bread into her pocket. Hoarding. The reflex of someone who has learned that safety never lasts. Alaric saw it happen. He said nothing about it. He understood, better than most, that some wounds you don't argue someone out of, you just make sure they never need to have it again. But sympathy alone wasn't going to keep her safe. That was the brutal truth sitting underneath all of it. Under the law of the time, a married woman had almost no independent legal existence, and on paper, Penelope still belonged to Viscount Carlisle. If Alaric simply announced she was alive, the courts could force him to hand her straight back to the man who'd broken her. Carlisle had friends in high places, debts he called in, favors he'd bought with hunting weekends and gambling markers. A duke going up against that kind of quiet, established corruption through the courts would lose, and lose badly. "Then we don't use the courts," Alaric said. "We use whatever it takes." It was Penelope who handed him the weapon. During those 3 years in Yorkshire, forbidden from leaving her rooms except when her husband required an audience, she'd found one small freedom: on the nights Carlisle drank himself into a stupor, she would slip out to tidy his study, a perfect cover for simply being out of her room. And while she tidied, she read. She'd learned that Carlisle held a lucrative Royal Navy contract to supply English oak for warship hulls out of Portsmouth. What she'd also learned, what she'd kept locked away in her memory for 3 years, waiting, was that the English oak was nothing of the sort. Cheap, unseasoned Baltic pine and elm, shipped in on unmarked schooners, re-stamped with his estate seal, sold to the Admiralty at premium prices while inspectors were quietly paid to look away. It wasn't fraud. It was treason, dressed up in fine timber. A warship built from unseasoned pine wouldn't survive a real storm, let alone cannon fire. Men would drown for Carlisle's greed, and he knew it. "He keeps a ledger," she said. "Red leather, locked in his desk. Every shipment, every bribe, every lie, in his own hand." There was a particular kind of silence that fell over the room when Alaric understood what she was offering him. The frightened scullery maid was gone entirely. In her place sat a woman who had spent years quietly gathering the exact instrument of her husband's destruction and simply waiting for someone capable of using it. "You've been planning this for years," he said. "I was waiting in the dark," she answered. "I just needed a thief." He became one. Dressed like a dockworker, he waited in the alley behind Carlisle's Mayfair townhouse on the one night a week the household's guard was reliably distracted, Tuesdays, when Carlisle hosted private card games that ran until dawn and kept the servants confined below stairs. Alaric broke a windowpane with molasses and canvas to muffle the sound, forced the desk drawer with an iron bar, and found the ledger exactly where she'd said it would be. He nearly didn't make it out. Carlisle himself walked into the study looking for cigars while Alaric stood frozen behind the curtains, close enough to hear the man complain about his luck at cards. By dawn, the ledger was in the hands of the First Lord of the Admiralty. By noon, Royal Marines were kicking in the front doors of Grosvenor Square, dragging Viscount Carlisle out in his shirt-sleeves while London's aristocracy scattered in a panic, desperate not to be associated with a man about to hang for treason. He was executed weeks later. And the moment the Crown seized a traitor's assets, the legal chain binding Penelope to him simply ceased to exist. A dead man has no wife. A traitor has no property. She was, on paper and in fact, finally, completely free. Freedom didn't arrive like relief, though. It arrived slowly, awkwardly, the way healing usually does. For the first weeks, Penelope barely left her room. She slept on the floor because the mattress felt like a trick. She flinched at creaking floorboards. Alaric didn't push. He left books outside her door, kept her fire burning, and simply stayed, present, patient, asking nothing of her except that she keep breathing. Then one afternoon, from behind a closed door, he heard something he hadn't heard in 5 years, music. Clumsy, halting, imperfect Mozart drifting out of a room where a piano had sat untouched for days. It wasn't the sound of a frightened servant. It was the sound of Penelope Alden, quietly, stubbornly, coming back to life. By late November, she stood waiting for him in the library, the same hearth, wearing silk instead of rags, her hair free of cold dust, her eyes finally calm instead of stormy. Carlisle had been hanged the day before. There was no triumph in how she said it. Just the flat, clean relief of a chapter finally closing. "You saved my life," she told him. "You saved your own," he said. "I just picked a lock." She laughed, really laughed, for what he realized was the first time in 5 years, and the sound cracked something open in his chest that he'd kept sealed shut since a rainy churchyard half a decade earlier. He offered her everything a gentleman was supposed to offer a woman in her position: a quiet estate somewhere far from London, a new name, an income, total independence, total safety. He meant every word of it, even though it terrified him to say it, because he loved her enough to let her walk away if that's what she needed. She didn't want Cornwall. She stepped closer instead, her hand resting against his coat like she was testing whether they, were actually real. "I don't want to be safe in the countryside," she told him. "I want to live. I want the man who didn't pity the scullery maid. The man who poured water on the ashes instead of asking me to finish scrubbing them. I'm not the girl you promised to marry before you went to sea, Alaric. I have scars. I have terrible dreams. I'm not easy to love anymore." "I'm not the boy who made that promise either," he answered. "I've spent 5 years talking to a ghost. I don't want easy. I want you." When he finally kissed her, there was nothing dramatic about it, no sweeping music, no fireworks. Just two people who had survived things no one should have to survive, finally standing still long enough to find each other again. Some love stories are about chance meetings and sweeping romance. This one is about something quieter and, honestly, more powerful: the choice two broken people make, every single day afterward, to keep rebuilding a life out of what's left. Penelope didn't need rescuing in the end. She needed someone willing to stand beside her while she rescued herself. If this story stayed with you, do me a favor and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like hers. Drop a comment if you'd want to hear more history-inspired tales like this one, share it with someone who loves a story with real grit behind the romance, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.